Welcome to R&R Living Life. What a way to start an episode as the sun rises over Hamelin Pool. The vibrant colours in the east were vastly different to the pastel colours of the west. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't been standing there watching. Then just as the sun hit the horizon, such dark colours. Today we planned as a rest day, but we did go for a walk down to the pool to see if the stromatolites were more visible at low tide. Later that day, Rick checked the boat and Gidget while I caught up on some things, as the following day would be a travelling day. We left Hamelin Pool and made our way towards Denham along the Hamelin Bay Road, stopping at the World Heritage sign to check Gidget and on past the useless loop turn-off to Steep Point. Much of the bitumen road was through straight, undulating sand ridges, with Hamelin Pool on the driver's side, before reaching the turn-off to the beachside resort of Nanga, with its expansive and secluded beach, with access to Henry Freycinet Harbour, situated on the western prong of the Perrin Peninsula in Shark Bay. Of course, we had to go and have a look-see. Nanga was originally a working sheep station, running several thousand head of sheep, and is now a conservation area, with the original homestead converted to accommodation. We turned around in the parking area of the caravan park and returned to the Shark Bay Road. The Perrin Peninsula is a long, narrow peninsula, about 130 kilometres long, running north-northwest along the West Australian coastline, starting east of Henry Freycinet Harbour and west of Hamelin Pool and Frau Island. Further along is the narrower section of the peninsula, the Tarifa Isthmus, between Nanga on the west coast of Henry Freycinet Harbour and Gulet Bluff on the eastern coastline of Laharadon Bight, both bodies of water being part of Shark Bay. Until we reached Denham, we were travelling through South Perrin, where the landscape of low shrubland on red sand dunes that was once part of the Perrin pastoralise until Perrin Peninsula was bought by the Western Australian Government in 1990, while the northern part of the peninsula became Francis Perrin National Park in 1993. South Perrin remains unallocated government land. From Nanga we made our way to Shell Beach Conservation Park, just off Shark Bay Road, crossing a couple of dry lakes on the way. Shell Beach, just as the name implies, is made up of trillions of fragum cockle shells. Wow, what a beach! After 4,000 years of being washed onto these beaches, shells in places have reached depths of 9 metres. Older, deeper layers have been compacted and cemented into a limestone called coquina, and occurs around the shores of Hamelin Pool and Laharadon Bight under layers of loose shells. The older shell ridges or slight rises running parallel to the shoreline formed about 4,000 years ago, when the sea level was higher and the waters were lower in salinity, allowing other shellfish species to survive. Being competitors or predators of the fragum cockle helped keep their numbers down. This amazing cockle needs sunlight to survive, as they have millions of single-celled algae called zooxanthia living in their soft bodies that photosynthesize, producing food for the cockles. They prefer to live in waters between 1.2 and 6.5 metres deep, so as to give the algae the most sunlight. As well, the cockles sit upright and open their shells to let in the sunlight. As rain falls, it absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and creates a weak acid. Calcium carbonate, the main ingredient of the shells, is slowly dissolved by the weak acid, with the resulting calcite solution cementing everything together into a limestone. Unlike other rock-forming processes, coquina formation leaves most of its ingredients relatively unchanged, so shells and other hard items such as animal bones remain recognisable. Shell Beach and Hamelin Pool are only two of a handful of places on Earth where shells replace beach sand in such a dramatic and picturesque way. The small burrowing mollusks are found here, with larger shells found along the coastline between Hartmann Alvarez Islands near Geraldton and Dampier, but are most abundant in the hypersaline reaches of Shark Bay, where its clear and shallow waters are a pristine environment that is truly remarkable. The four-sill formed in the last 10,000 years is a barrier made of sand and seagrass that allows seawater to flow into the bay at high tide but restricts outflow at low tide. Evaporation in the shallow bays and low regional rainfall, with only one river feeding into the bay, making the bays almost twice as salty as the ocean, resulted in the lack of competition and predators for the fragum cockle. As sea levels dropped and the water became saltier, ridges formed near the new high tide mark, and with fewer shellfish species unable to survive as the salt content increased. It is hard to imagine that these tiny shells stretch for over 70 kilometres and are between 7 and 10 metres deep in places. In the early 1900s, the shells were quarried and hard packed, cut into blocks and used to construct a number of historic buildings in the nearby town of Denham, including St Andrew's Church, the old Pearlers Restaurant, and several station homesteads. Just south of Shell Beach is an electrified fence stretching several kilometres across the narrow part of the peninsula as part of Project Eden, a conservation project limiting feral animals on Perrin Peninsula. From Shell Beach we made our way to Whalebone Point Scenic Lookout, surrounded by the porous cliffs of Tamala limestone, formed about 125,000 years ago from shells and marine skeletons. Again we were exposed to stunning views out over the bay and along the coastline, with its curving 200-metre-long west-facing beach that hugged the calm waters of the shallow bay, backed by about a 50-metre-wide four-dune plain. From Whalebone Point we made our way to Eagle Bluff, featuring a spectacularly high cliff overlooking the turquoise waters of Denham Sound, the name originating from the osprey or sea eagles that build their nest on the rock-based Eagle Island offshore. 18,000 years ago, Eagle Bluff was very different, consisting of a dry landscape, as during the last ice age the sea level was much lower and the bay was a vast dry stretch of land. Then, about 4,000 years ago, after the Ice Age, the sea level rose about 3 metres higher than it is today and flooded Shark Bay, creating the islands and peninsulas. Mangroves that were once there have gone, and in the last few thousand years seagrass meadows have colonised the shallow waters. We followed the boardwalk that extends out over the ocean and along the cliff edge, and were rewarded with views of sharks following stingrays and turtles in the clear waters below. From the boardwalk we could also see two small limestone islands where seabirds breed. Eagle Island, about 200 metres off Eagle Bluff, is a sand island with an area of about 1,000 square metres and about 8 metres above sea level, covered in closed heath. Silver gulls nest on the island and a small number of pied cormorants roost there. The islands were once buried under centuries of accumulated guano, bird droppings. Rich in phosphate, guano was prized as a fertiliser around 1850 when ships arrived and stripped the islands of Shark Bay bare. We could just make out Harrison Prong across the bay, on which Useless Loop is situated. The environment of Shark Bay is shaped by the 400,000 hectares of seagrass meadows, trapping sediments and building sand and seagrass banks that restrict water flow and causes unusual salinity gradients that affect what lives and grows in Shark Bay. The massive seagrass banks are food for dugongs, a species threatened by extinction worldwide. The dark waters are seagrass beds, while in closer, where the colours are lighter, is sand. As the seagrass banks trap sediment and enlarge, they become shallower, but when it becomes too shallow that the seagrass is exposed at low tide, it dies off, leaving bare areas in the shallows, resulting in the meadows continually shifting away from the shallows they create. From Eagle Bluff we made our way into Denham, parking up at the caravan park, and I spent what was left of the afternoon doing the washing. It had been an interesting day travelling. Denham is a small coastal community which has grown up around the pearling, wool and fishing industries, and more recently tourism, especially since the area was declared a World Heritage Area in 1991. Denham is above the 26 degrees south parallel latitude, which divides Western Australia, beginning at Shark Bay on the coast, and becomes the border between South Australia and the Northern Territory, and is a circle of latitude that is 26 degrees south of the Earth's equatorial plane. Denham is the most westerly town in Australia, with a long European history dating back to when the Dutch sea captain Dirk Hartog in 1616 made the first recorded landfall by a European on an island, which now bears his name just west of the present town. The unique World Heritage Area covers some 12,000 square kilometres and possesses some of the world's most unique marine and land-dwelling wildlife. Captain Henry Mangles Denham chartered this region of Australia in 1858 aboard the HMS Herald and gave the town his name. Like all rural and remote towns in Western Australia, power for the town comes in vastly different forms. Here in Denham, in an Australian first trial, renewable hydrogen, where the electricity generated by the town's solar farm is converted into hydrogen, which will power a fuel cell capable of generating electricity for 100 homes, or 20% of the town's power demand. It is expected that this renewable hydrogen will reduce the town's use of diesel by 140,000 litres per year. The following day began cloudy, but the sunrise made for some interesting colours. On the way to Monkey Mia, Rick saw 2 eagles on the side of the road, but I was not fast enough, so missed them. Monkey Mia, with its resort, shop, cafe and caravan park, is such a touristy spot, but who could blame it? I was disappointed by some of the crowd who thought that it was only their children who had come to watch the dolphins. For over 30 years, a pod of wild bottlenose dolphins have visited this pristine beach at Monkey Mia. Most mornings, and again around midday, depending on weather conditions and tides, they majestically appear in the shallow waters with their intelligence and grace, to be fed a small amount of fresh fish, never more than a third of their daily food requirements, so as not to become dependent on handouts. It was interesting watching a mother and her calf being fed, and a turtle enjoying life beside the jetty. I realised they are wild creatures, and I did enjoy watching them, but I think I had expected to see some more dolphins. From Monkey Mia we made our way back to Perrin Heritage Precinct, an interesting old sheep station and homestead, where conditions dictated the survival of the station. Perrin was first leased as a sheep station in 1883, and by 1888 almost the entire peninsula was under lease, and over the next century its fortunes fluctuated depending on the weather, wool prices and the availability of groundwater. As Perrin Peninsula has no permanent surface water, in 1922 the first bore on the peninsula was sunk, greatly increasing the viability of grazing. Although there were good times, trouble was never far away. Thick scrub made mustering difficult. Lambing occurred randomly, and although the wool was of fine grade, it contained sand and twigs, resulting in low prices. In the late 1940s, the shearing operation was moved from Denham to near the homestead due to problems with shearers drinking at the pub and not turning up for work. Stocking rates varied enormously depending on rainfall, while during the 1950s and 60s Sheep numbers reached a peak of 142,000 across the region, with wool prices reaching their peak, but slowly dropped until the 7-year drought in the late 1970s saw a huge drop in sheep numbers. Marginal stations like Perrin were dealt a blow in the 1990s when rising costs and dropping wool prices pushed them out of the market. With the Perrin pastoral lease bought in 1990 by the state government for conservation purposes, making this area a conservation area, with Shark Bay being granted Western Australia's first World Heritage listed area in 1991, followed shortly after in 1993 by Francis Perron National Park being proclaimed. Today, conservation is the main focus of Perrin Peninsula, with aims to reintroduce previously extinct native animals. It was interesting walking through the historic buildings, the shearing shed, the cookhouse and stockyards, with many pastoral relics and signs explaining the fascinating history of the station. From Perrin Historic Precinct we made our way back to Denham, stopping at Nicholson Point where we could see the shallow waters of Little Lagoon, where at very low tide a sandbar sometimes appears, creating a mirror-like flat surface. From the point we made our way down to the edge of the lagoon, covered in many different shells. Little Lagoon is a saline lake that evaporated thousands of years ago, thought to have been formed during the Pleistocene era over 11,000 years ago, when it was inundated by rising seas after the last ice age. Around that time the sea was much lower and the coastline many kilometres further west of where it is today. Around 4,000 years ago, the rising sea levels after the Ice Age flooded the area, forming a lagoon. The sea level may have been 2 to 3 metres higher than it is today. Over the last 4,000 years, the lagoon has remained connected to the sea via a small creek. What a day! Wild animals, history, interesting scenery with a stunning sunrise. I certainly needed a rest after that, but spent what was left of the afternoon wandering around town, checking out the jetty and the historic buildings made from shells. St Andrew's Anglican Church by the sea looks like any other brick building until you get up close and can see the shells in the bricks, as was the bricks used in the old Pearler's restaurant. We only walked around the outside of the restaurant, but did venture into the church where it was quite cool, and I think the services held there would be great on a hot day. I will leave you in Denham for this episode. I hope you have enjoyed it. Give us a thumbs up if you did. Join us next time as we explore Cape Perrin before moving on to Carnarvon. Take care and stay safe. Cheers for now. Rick and Rosemary. R&R, living life.